Magic is found in every room, where people connect over a shared purpose. In this weekly podcast, Luke, Hannah and Chris explore the role of purpose, courage, mindset and culture in every leader's quest for transformational performance.
Hello, welcome to Magic in the Room. I'm Chris Province.
And I am Luke Freeman. And today we're going to talk about something pretty interesting. It's just the two of us, which is kind of cool.
Right.
Usually we've got someone else. And although we miss Hannah, I don't know, when's the last time we had just two people talking?
Yeah, it's been a minute.
Been a few episodes.
Yeah.
So today we're going to talk about the housing crisis, specifically the affordable housing crisis, and how it's affecting a lot of employers across the U.S. Now, what you may or may not know about us is that 50-60% of our work is in hospitality. And in these kind of service industry roles, there is typically like lower than average, financial return for the people doing the work every day. So in medium to low wage environments, this affordable housing shortage that we're experiencing across the U.S. is having just really devastating effects, both to businesses who are having a hard time finding people who can actually afford to live for what they're being offered to pay, but then also from the employee side as well, some really challenging real things that people are struggling with every day. So, but before we get into that, because it's all a bunch of heavy stuff, I just want to anchor us with a minute with just like some gratitude. So we're coming here today from our studio in Tulsa, working with awesome Brad and Ben who are in here with us that you can't see if you're watching this on YouTube. But Chris, today, here we are in Tulsa, downtown. What's something that you're grateful for that is powering you through today?
Let's see. Today, I will be grateful for just little moments with special people, like 5 minutes with someone I care a lot about. Today, and just out of the blue, I was taking Landon to school this morning, and I just said, "Hey, Sloan, you want to go with me?" Typically she'll ride with Megan and take Spencer to school and then to the grandparents. And I'm like, yeah, Sloan, you want to go with me today? And took Landon to school. And then Sloan and I grabbed a donut, which is always a little bit of rite of passage. And so we spent, 5 or 10 minutes in the donut shop, and that was a special moment. So I think, it doesn't have to be big events. So, but today I'm thankful for that decision and the 5, 7, 10 minutes that we got to spend together grabbing a donut.
Yeah. Awesome. For me, the thing that comes to mind, and this is going to be a little weird, counterintuitive, but my partner, Marla, is feeling a little bit under the weather today. And we both got kind of some boosters and stuff yesterday. And she's not feeling 100%. And so this morning I was able to work at home and take the boys to school. And, that sounds weird, but I think especially preparing for this affordable housing conversation and the reality of what people are facing, just really grateful that we're in a space where we can do that and be flexible. And there is flexibility. For a lot of folks, there isn't. And, one spouse getting sick or getting injured on the job or a kid being sick can be a pretty traumatic thing, and just kind of stop all the trains from leaving the station. And so, I'm grateful that I can take water to someone who's not feeling great and take kids to school and continue to work and get things done that I need to get done. And so, lots of folks can't say that. And
right.
So I'm grateful for that.
You bet. And I'm really looking forward to the conversation we're having today. And I think before diving in, I think it's just to do a little bit of framing. I guess what really tipped this conversation for me, it was really twofold. one, we always kept asking the same question about jobs we couldn't fill. It's like, well, pay more. Like, if we can't get people at $10 an hour, pay $11 an hour. If we can't get people at 11, pay 12. If we can't get people at 12, pay 13, so on and so forth, right?
Mm-hmm.
Until we can fill the job. One day, I was just sitting here looking at this list of job vacancies in this really tight labor market. And then I was thinking, if I was to accept this job, where would I live? And there was nowhere to live. And it was an aha moment. And like, okay, it's not that we don't have people because we don't pay well for the position. We don't have any people because there's nowhere for people to live here.
Yeah.
And it's super interesting because this really starts out as an issue from the coast that has migrated inland.
Yeah.
Especially like during the pandemic. And now as you have people moving from these, was historically more expensive coastal residences to more inland, better cost of living. But what's that doing? Like they're carrying the problem with them. So we're getting more and more just markets where low unemployment, low housing availability, and it's creating like we're not getting enough resources in our organizations to do the work. So that's the first kind of thing here is it was an aha moment where I realized like we might be asking the wrong question.
Yeah.
We were thinking about how much does the job pay when it's a little bit about where the people are going to live or how are they going to live if they accept the job.
Yeah.
And that's where I want to right up front release blame in any of this about the models, because like healthy businesses take care of people, like unhealthy businesses do not. And a healthy business means that it's profitable. And like a lot of these legacy financial models were built during a different labor market. So what's happened is the labor market has grown much differently or has evolved much differently than the housing market. And there's just massive misalignment. I don't know what else to say. Like these markets have not moved together, but they both have evolved appropriately in their vacuums.
Yeah.
And that's what's so I'm enamored by that issue. Like the labor market moves appropriately and projects and grows and develops in a predictable way. And the housing market does the same thing. But then there's this interdependence that we really don't calculate. And now, I guess the roosters come home and now what?
Yeah. So I know that we talk about this a little bit as an economics issue and as a moral issue. So there's kind of these two different ways to look at it. And I think before we dig into the economics, there's a story that you've shared about just a realization you had on property one time. So you're in a large hospitality on site with the organization, and like share a little bit about that story. And I think there's a housekeeper, right?
Yeah.
You're just kind of having some realization.
Yeah. I mean, I'm thinking about this. And I'm staying in this beautiful property. Okay. 5-star place, EBITDA, $120 million last year, like healthy bottom line, great property, great leadership. Okay. But I go in and out of property. I go to meetings off site. I walk by the housekeeper in the morning. Hello, how you doing? Have a great day. Exchange pleasantries. Go to my meeting off site. Go to dinner after that meeting, like come back from dinner, and that housekeeper is parked on kind of the far reaches of that parking lot at that property. And like she's sleeping in her car.
Yeah.
So here's this well-led, healthy balance sheet business. And here's the lady that cleans my room sleeping in her car. And I think there's some notion or some gravity to want to call out morality in that conversation.
Mm-hmm.
What I would say is like, that's not the place to call that out.
Mm.
It's not the systems. Like, this is a systems issue.
Yeah.
It's not somebody's choosing to have someone live that way.
Right.
You know?
Right. No one's saying that's what I want for my team member.
Right.
And this is, their problem, not my problem.
Right.
I get that. I think as we go through the economics conversation, though, to me, the moral question is, when I realize that the system that we have been using isn't working anymore, when am I compelled to try something new and do something different? And how bold can I be to make that adjustment? So we're going to talk about a lot of different ideas and things that people could try. And I guess I just wanted to frame it in by saying we all get to choose how much energy we give to this problem.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not trying to guilt anyone or say, oh, you have to go develop a housing assistance program, or you have to, like, it's a moral imperative that you go figure out what size shuttle bus you need to purchase and staff and start running to get people to a place that they can afford housing from work, and vice versa. Like, I'm not saying any of that or any prescriptive, other than when we see something not working, we should, as leaders, dig in to really understand the issue and understand what our options are and make a conscious choice. Even if our conscious choice is to not take action,
Mm-hmm.
that's a measured, intentional choice, because either there's not a need or not the resource or whatever it is, right? Rather than, well, I can't solve that, I'm just moving on.
Yeah. And exactly. It goes back to everything else about intentional leadership. What do we notice? When do we notice it? And now, I'm going to make this choice about what do I do about it. But pretending that I don't see it shouldn't be the option for a courageous leader. It's, yes, I see that. And because of that, I'm going to address some type of need.
Yeah.
Or, yes, I see that. And for whatever reasons, I'm constrained and cannot address that need.
Mm-hmm.
But it's about the intentional choice.
Yeah.
And like, notice, choose, act, kind of following that scale, about just making sure that we're intentional. But I mean, is there like looking at service and hospitality, which just has a lot of like low and medium wage positions as part of its financial model.
Mm-hmm.
Like, is there a bigger threat to that industry other than no affordable housing?
Yeah, because I think if we made the argument, there's no bigger threat to this industry, than not being able to get the talent we need to operate. I think a lot of people would say, yeah, that's the issue. I was at a conference a couple months ago and they polled everyone and they said, yeah, that's the biggest issue. So yeah, lots of heads nodding. But what I hear you saying is, we'll peel that back. Why is talent, yes, there's a lot of issues mixed in there, but what if the biggest bucket of talent issue was around the price of housing in this country? Then that would give us a place to really focus. So,
right.
Yeah.
And I think I hear a lot of times like, well, nobody wants to work. Well, unemployment's 2.3%. Like,
yeah. Most people, pretty much everyone's working already.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, that's a big, but you hear things like, people don't want to work, and I just think it's a little deeper than that. We, as leaders, we have to think about a little more complexity than that and say, okay, why are people not accepting this job?
Mm-hmm.
And considering macro and micro variables.
Yep.
What are the things in the larger environment? What are the things locally? Something about hospitality is they're typically late or 24/7 environments. So it's not Monday through Friday. So we'll start with the entire labor pool here,
Mm-hmm.
and then we knock off people that don't work weekends. And then we knock off people that don't work nights. And then we knock off parents because there's no 24-hour daycare. And then we get into those decisions like, you can't have purple hair. You can't have went bankrupt. You can't have too much debt. So, I mean, in a lot of our service industries, especially those that are regulated, that you start with this much labor pool and you end up with 10% of the population.
Yeah.
Because of those constraints. And, like, if I'm an operator, is it my responsibility to provide childcare? No. But understand, like, if we don't, we knock off that portion of the labor pool.
Mm-hmm.
So, that's those decisions we do control. It tends to exacerbate the issue when we don't allow for the larger labor pool to exist.
Yeah. So let's look at the macros. I have some data here, and so I'll just kind of read through and hit some highlights, and then I want to hear your takeaways from those. So, in 2021, nationwide home and rent prices increased nearly 20%. That's the highest increase since 1979. The U.S. was short 3.79 million homes in 2019. That's 130% increase over 2012. And researchers are saying that 169 metro areas likely aren't building enough housing to keep up with demand. That's up from 100 metro areas. So up from 100 to 169. It was 100 in 2012. So when you see numbers like that, you mentioned the unemployment rate, 2.5%, whatever it is, low. What do you read like between the lines there?
Yeah. I think one, you're calling out some great metrics, and what I would encourage people to do is dive into like whatever area you might be operating in or where you live and work. Go ahead and dive into your unemployment numbers. Look how those are trending. Look at your new residential home permits issued. That Redfin produces a lot of information around that you can find. And also look at wage growth for the area. And you take these things and you can kind of get an idea of what it would feel like to move into that particular market. But I think when was the last time it felt like they weren't building houses as fast as they could screw them together?
Yeah.
Like this idea that we are 3.79 million homes short of the demand. Like that's really the thing. This is all when we look at the housing side, it's all a supply and demand issue. Like there just isn't enough homes. And if I'm building homes, am I building affordable homes or am I building high-end homes? Like It's all going to be based on like, how am I going to make margin, right? I want to run a profitable business, and the smaller homes that I build, the lower the margin is going to be, or the more of those homes I have to sell to make the same money.
Yeah.
So it's not just like we're home short, or also like where the market is built isn't necessarily where, service and hospitality industry needs these things. You have effective bans on the construction of multifamily housing in a lot of markets. Not helpful when we're looking for service and hospitality employees.
Yeah.
So if we're operating in a market that has anything that looks like restrictions on builds of multifamily housing, we're going to be in trouble.
Yeah. Yeah. So I know another dynamic here is there's some population migration trends happening nationally. So tell us a little bit about that, and how is that driving housing prices, maybe in places that haven't typically had as much pressure on housing prices.
Yeah. And this, now I miss Hannah because she's like experiencing this. She has the front row seat.
Hannah, if you're listening, I missed you the entire time.
Right. Me too. No. So like this whole issue has migrated especially during the pandemic, as remote work becomes more available or people reevaluate their position in life. They think, well, how come I'm living here in San Francisco paying I've got this house worth $1.4 million. It's a 2-bedroom, 2-bath. I can take this and buy, 2 lots in Oklahoma City and build, a 4,000 square foot home, multi-story, all the fixtures, right? And live a life that, I could be afforded, or maybe one that looks like the one that I want. I don't know. But effectively, I could nearly retire just by repositioning where my life takes place. So what's wild is the folks moving from the coast or, New England to the middle parts of the country. We're talking about them driving up cost on housing 25 to 55%. And these are places like Boise, like Bozeman, specifically like one close to us, Oklahoma City, is, experiencing something just unprecedented. Oklahoma City is 10th in the country in the number of residential housing permits issued per capita. And it's the first city on the list that's less than $300,000 average build cost. So you're seeing like explosive growth in that market. So these are kind of safe cities, middle of nowhere. I want to live the country life, or I can buy a plot of land and build on it, or I can have horses, or, all these kind of mental images. And, obviously there's political drivers behind some of that. Get it. But that's how this problem is migrating, because there's still short housing on the coasts. But now as those people move inland, it's creating price increases here. Specifically, let's take a look at like Oklahoma City. What is the net effect of that? You mentioned, rent and housing costs up 20% nationwide, but go look at your micro market. And if we take a deeper look at Oklahoma City in particular, mortgage costs are only up 17% year over year. Rental cost, average rent is up 42% year over year.
Yeah.
So you're talking about moving from $920 a month average rent to $1,360 average rent. I think those are the numbers. But that is significant. An extra $400 a month for, your average family to have an average place to stay. And of course, like, we're never going to put the narrative as an employer, like, hey, do you want a job where you can afford to live somewhere, or one you don't? Right? Like, we're never going to, like, it's not, as an operator, like, that's not my system.
Yeah.
I don't run the housing system.
Right.
Right. I'm running a service and hospitality company that has this labor model. And now I've got a problem as an operator because the housing market and that model has moved away from the labor model.
Right.
And that's my issue. Now, I don't know that I can solve that.
Right.
I don't know if it's my problem to solve. But I think as we evaluate this, it comes down to a lot of that concept of, being intentional about what we select to action, and what are some things, if we surveyed what's happening with, different employee employee assisted housing functions, like what could those feasibly look like? I think that's our responsibility to ask those questions. But different communities are obviously impacted differently. If you think about the types of communities that typically work in service and hospitality, just a lot of this burden falls to working families, people with lower incomes, and minorities. I think it's 70% of low or moderate income earners find themselves financially strained just by housing costs.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So we're not talking about food yet, transportation, extracurricular activities for their kids, right? Things that you or I might take for granted.
Mm-hmm.
Like 70% of these families think, man, just housing buries me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's a 2022 number. So that's a this year study. 70% of low to moderate income earners find themselves financially strained by housing costs.
Yeah.
And I think, to your point about who's impacted there is an equity conversation to be had. I mean, we know that underserved communities, minorities, are more burdened by these trends than other communities in our country. So there is an equity issue as well. So let's transition to what do we do about it?
Mm-hmm.
The good news is there are organizations who have been intentional, who have been responsive, and who are trying things, especially when you think about the coasts, right? As you said, this is not a new problem for a lot of communities.
Right.
So we have the opportunity, as this comes to our neighborhoods, wherever we're located, to look at some best practice that people have established. So walk us through, like, what are the options? If I'm a leader, what are some things that I need to write down and say, I need to learn more about that. That's something that I need to find an expert in. I want to look at the data on that. How are some folks responding?
Yeah. I mean, well, I think one, it's just knowing that by offering housing benefits, it's a way that employers can brand, set themselves apart. I also think when you have a healthy climate, if you have a healthy climate and you're kind of developmentally investing in your work community, and you have housing options, I think there can be a lot of goodness in that.
Yeah.
I think there's a ton of danger in not building healthy climate and investing in, especially like on-site residential type housing. Like that's kind of a recipe for disaster.
Yeah.
Right. So again, it's a lot about asking the right questions, finding alignment, but
yeah. So I just want to pause for a second there, because what I heard you say, I just want to sit on this for a second with folks, is I don't want to just, I'm going to put one piece of the recipe into play when really the recipe calls for 2 or 3 different things for it to work.
Right.
Right. We're deploying a system, especially if we're thinking about building or offering any sort of employment housing, that requires other ingredients. It's not just a peanut butter sandwich is not one slice of bread.
Right. Yeah.
You got to have a jar of peanut butter in the cabinet too. So, what I hear you say is, if we're thinking about offering some sort of residential service, like, our organizational culture, climate have to be healthy. There's infrastructure that has to be built for that. There's policy that has to be built for that. So this isn't I'm going to go to deploy a couple $1 million and then yay, half of my problem solved.
Right. And I think especially those of us who are in service and hospitality, a lot of times when we say employee housing, we immediately think that on-site apartment build, as long as you work there, you can live there. And the minute you don't work there, you're gone.
Yeah.
And so I want to break us out of that idea and really say, like, what we're talking about is employer assisted housing programs, whether that is what that scenario that I just spoke of, or maybe it's a rental program, maybe it's a home ownership program, but effectively employer assisted housing is any program that moves forward rental or home ownership that an employer helps finance. Right. So and it has this intention to provide a channel for the employee and the employer to like partner in that cost of owning or renting a home. And typically what you'll see is these will happen in places near the workplace.
Yeah.
Right. Because obviously if you establish these programs and they support, a residential offering that is many miles from work,
Mhm.
now you're again, systemic, right? Or it's systematic. I'm introducing transportation problems now.
Yep.
If I do this 20 miles away from the actual place of business.
Yep.
So we always want to be aware of those things.
Yeah. And just case study there. You mentioned Bozeman earlier. So Hannah's hometown up there. I'm lucky enough to get to be up there pretty often. But Big Sky Resorts, Big Sky is a mountain community, resort community about an hour from Bozeman. And it's, an hour drive up a canyon, 2-lane state highway to get from the city up to this resort community. So one of the resorts that operates a lot of hospitality up in the resort area in Big Sky, they're building modular homes
Mm-hmm.
right down there, 45 minutes, an hour from their sites. And just, man, in the last few months, every time I drive by, there's probably capacity for another 30, 50 people every month just in how fast they're building employee housing. But what I also know to be true is that they're running shuttles every shift up and down that canyon on that highway to get people to work and back. And so, when I think about the system that they had to build, it's a huge one. When I think about food for those folks, there's only one grocery store in the town. And then where they're building this housing, there's not a grocery store within walking distance of this housing that they're building. So I'm guessing there's also some sort of food solution for how do we feed everyone in this housing complex that we're building. So I think that's the kind of thing. I just want to give a real life example that, literally you can go and type in Big Sky employee housing and pull up this project online.
Yeah. And that's, I'm glad you brought that up because especially in like these high cost of living areas,
Mhm.
like those you just mentioned, like businesses without the build out, like we're challenged for recruitment. You run into that chronic understaffing, chronic stress, increased burnout for the team. Like those are just some of the things that happen as a result of the chronic understaffing.
Mhm.
But then and this is what the science shows is when we can help an employee secure housing, that like there is not only the elevated sense of self, but the elevated sense of security.
Mhm.
There's an elevated sense of security when that is close to my work. I don't have to, I don't have as many transportation issues. I'm not commute as long. I have an increased work-life balance.
Mhm.
And because of those things, I'm more productive. Like I contribute with higher morale.
Mhm.
And what the science says is the sentiment is they're more willing to go the extra mile to make sure their company grows and succeeds.
Yep.
Because that's exactly what the company has done for them.
Right.
But again, it's right climate.
Right.
But this is what is possible.
Mhm.
But I don't know if we should put an asterisk here and say results not typical, right? Like it takes more courage and intentional implementation. And so we can talk about what it can be,
Yeah.
but also understand like the positive benefits of this require a lot of different parts.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And I would say there's a lot of perspective taking that's necessary. So think about if you are a caregiver and you have an elderly family member at home, how different is your experience going to work for an 8 or a 10 or a 12-hour shift if you are 3 miles from home or if you are 40 miles from home? There is a different experience, a different ability to be present, a different amount of checking in and phone calls and texting that you feel like you need to do just to feel secure and safe on your path through the day.
100%. And, so when we start thinking about this is a supply and demand issue.
Mm-hmm.
So there are really supply and demand solutions. When we think about what are some demand side employee assistance or employee assisted housing benefits, demand side solutions could be like, how does a company help with down payments for homes or closing cost assistance?
Mm-hmm.
And when you see these types of programs, a lot of times they're stair step to be forgiven over a specific period of time. So if it's not down payment or closing cost assistance, maybe if it's on the rental side, it could be rent subsidies. It could be home buyer education,
Mm-hmm.
secondary financing, moving cost assistance. But the terms that can be issued by an organization as part of one of these programs can always be more flexible than a bank or than a credit card or
Mm-hmm.
other ways that low or medium wage employees try to access this capital.
Yep.
Right? And when we say, what keeps a low income earner, like bad debt.
Mm-hmm.
And they do what it takes to chase this idea of ownership or rentership. And typically they resort to bad money. And it just creates this whole cascade of things where organizations, like, when intentional, when deployed as a system, they can just provide the flexibility and different terms
Mm-hmm.
to help their communities grow.
Well, I mean, if I'm in the employer side of that, do I want, when one of my high performing, low wage employees has a family emergency, do I want that emergency to blow up their life and me have no control over it because they've taken out a payday loan or because they've put it on their card or whatever else? Or do I want the option to say, for them to come and say, here's my doctor's note, here's how much surgery is, here's what happened to my car, whatever it is? Do I want the option to say, okay, I'm going to float you a month on the down payment assistant program?
Mm-hmm.
Do you have to do that? No, but I want the option.
Right.
Because if it's someone that I'm connected with and they're connected with our company, and I get to make the decision of if I get to float them and build loyalty and continue to invest in them, right at this point, we're probably months down the road from them onboarding. I know them. Right now I get to choose, do I carry the cost for an extra month so that they don't move back to their parents a state away or move in with their cousin somewhere that they can't continue to work with me?
Yeah. And so as you were speaking there, what I'm thinking about is, hey, maybe I don't do anything demand or supply side for a housing assistance program, but maybe I look at our particular work climate and I say, I can help with financial literacy.
Mm-hmm.
I can help by educating around how to properly use credit.
Mm-hmm.
We can maybe keep some of those low or even medium income earners from finding themselves with predatory creditors or
Right.
things like that.
And can I go a step further and say I can incentivize completion of a financial literacy course as a part of how much gets forgiven?
Right. I mean, so that's what I'm saying is, like, it's not about what we can't do. It's just kind of looking at the issue, accepting like these two markets haven't moved together and I can't align them.
Mm-hmm.
But are there things that, based on the climate that we want to build or culture that we want to emerge, does anything in this arena make sense for this particular organization to execute? But I don't think we can just leave off on demand side. If we turn it around and look at supply side benefits, like, these are much less common as far as programs, but these would be like cash contributions to developers to actually build some type of housing solution. Maybe it's land donation, construction financing, sometimes tax credits. Now, what's interesting though is, although these are less common in programs in general, a
Mhm.
lot of times you'll find these that exist in whether it's native jurisdictions, they're more rural, or in casino gaming in general. So you'll find a lot of just land donations, uh, credits, or some sort of incentive to build multifamily housing, or on site development of managed by the property, which
Mhm.
has a whole other set of challenges associated with that. Like, do I really want the place that I live managed by the same place or same people that I'm employed by? And so you
Mhm.
see a lot of that dynamic. And again, like, how intentional are we being about the system if that's the dynamic that exists? So we do see that a lot. Maybe that can be the right decision for some organizations. But I think the ask here is like, how do we process that, and
Yeah.
how do we create intentionality around it? There are multiple native hospitality and gaming organizations that consider exactly this, as part of their hiring practices. It and it scales. It says, okay, if you're a frontline, here's what that looks like. And on the front line, that is probably a supply side solution, like on-site apartments or near proximity to property, um, apartments or some sort of owned multifamily housing, duplexes, etc. Um, And then as they go up into executive ranges, they move towards demand side benefits.
Mhm.
So I think those are interesting. It's interesting to see organizations say, okay, we're trying to recruit executive management. We're going to use demand side, and because they're going to be of substantial enough earnings that they can leverage demand side benefits.
Mhm.
For lower wage and medium wage earners, we're going to offer a you know a supply side solution. So, because that's what fits them in
Mhm.
their place, as they're progressing through or growing and developing into their careers.
Yeah.
So, anytime an organization is savvy enough to really say, we're not just going to say everyone gets a supply side solution or everyone
Mhm.
gets a demand side solution. They're saying these positions make sense to have a demand side solution. These positions make sense to have a supply side solution. Let's go meet those needs and try
Yeah.
to build the best possible system to support them.
Yeah. All right, so let's jump into this, case study of an organization that's considering managing their own kind of multifamily employee housing facility. I know that we've already said that's not for everyone. It's a bit of an outlier, but what do you think that they should keep in mind?
Well, I mean, if you're trying to manage a multifamily employee housing facility, um, it's just very difficult for non-specialized entities. I touched on a lot of times you'll find, a casino operator managing a multifamily housing complex. Like, the management of these properties is a specialized function,
Mhm.
and it's not a hotel, right?
Yeah.
Managing a hotel is a specialized function. And I think a lot of times there's this off the cuff, well, if you can manage a hotel, you can manage multifamily housing, but that's not necessarily the case. So it's really considering like what demographics
Mhm.
are really populating the housing. Um, like, what is the probable prevalence of, we'll call them adverse social behaviors, whether that's domestic violence, drug use. Like,
Mhm.
what is the market look like,
Mhm.
right? Different geographies and different demographics, like, you can build a profile out of that.
Yeah.
Um, so, they're just like, what's the likelihood we're going to run into challenges with behaviors that are harmful to this community we're trying to create?
Mhm.
Because that's the idea. Like, we're trying to create this, environment or climate around this. But then, like, can we, without exception, have a zero tolerance tone for all behaviors that are harmful to the community within that supply? If you're doing a supply side solution,
Yeah.
that supplied multifamily housing complex. So it gets into some nitty gritty, like all the leases having language that like legally allows for eviction
Mm-hmm.
on the basis of these adverse social behaviors.
Yeah.
Right. So if you have a domestic, if you have drug use, if, even going into like, do you want to test? Do you, what are
Right.
those policies? But getting explicit and making sure that in those tenant agreements that you can evict based on those matters. And then also like something that we miss a lot of times, like registered tenant enforcement, like absolutely mandatory. Like it's this, like people get trafficked. And if you're providing this benefit to someone, do not think that someone's not going to say, hey, I'm going to need you to go work here at this property. You're going to take the housing benefit and I'm going to use it.
Yeah.
So people getting trafficked into supply side solutions is 100% possible, and why you have to have tenant enforcement as part of the operation.
Yeah. I mean, there is a level of risk there that's different than your average team member, right? There are lots of scenarios where someone goes home and participates off work hours in some type of, adverse social behaviors, and they're a fine employee and keep their job. And all of a sudden they move on to employer managed housing, and you might have to terminate, right? Or at least remove them from the housing. So there can be additional risk. The last thing before we kind of wrap up is I want to spend a minute on other disruptive compensation. I know we did an episode recently all around disruptive compensation. I think folks can go and listen to that, but just real quick, besides housing, there are other ways to back into how do we help people move the dollars they need to pay for housing. So food security, transportation assistance, we've already talked about. Anything else come to mind for you?
Financial literacy, we talked about, also like hygiene security, like something as simple as lockers and showers. Okay. So that would be something to be mindful of. Just what is most fundamental.
Mm-hmm.
And I think hygiene security is an easy one to justify, because in hospitality, service and hospitality, like who do you want your guest interacting with, and what are the aspirational attributes of that team member that's engaging with that guest?
Yeah.
And guess what? Like no home, no shower.
Yeah.
So just, I think there's a pretty simple ROI.
Yeah.
When we run into those sorts of issues.
Yeah. No, that's great. And then the last thing that I want to touch on is from an economic standpoint, the cost of turnover. And if you're considering some of these interventions, I would strongly recommend that you do a cost of turnover analysis. What does each new hire per role actually cost you? If you don't want to do the analysis, quick math, like between 15 to 30% of an employee's annual compensation is usually what it costs to turn them over. So if they're lower wage, it's going to be maybe closer to 15% of their annual salary. If they're higher, medium wage, it's going to be closer to 30%. But those are real dollars. And I think I would create a model that really helped identify the assumptions around how is this going to impact turnover in my organization? How many people per role do I think we're going to be able to keep longer, have a lower rate, right? You can figure out cost of turnover, and you can make assumptions on any of these interventions as to how you think that's going to impact, your cost savings for your HR, your training, onboarding, uniforms, everything else, all of that expense that comes with losing someone and a new person coming on.
Absolutely. And, outside of considering that cost of turnover, because housing certainly assist with that, I want to touch on the idea of how do I expand without it? Because there have been a number of enterprises that have done exceptionally well post-pandemic. And there are a number of enterprises saying, hey, we've done well. How do I expand our footprint? How do I, expand our enterprise, generate more revenue, like create long-term sustainability? Hey, let's build another hotel, like right there. Love that idea. Where are the people that are going to work there going to live?
Yeah.
So you get, our balance sheet now becomes constrained
Mm-hmm.
because we cannot deploy capital previously earned
Yep.
and staff the asset.
Yep.
So that I just want to kind of call that out.
Yeah.
It's not just retention, it's expansion. And how do we expand without a place for people to live?
Right. And the worst case scenario is that you would do your expansion and not include any sort of housing options or budget, and then have all these issues and have to come back later and tack it on while you're losing potential revenue because you only have certain hours for the restaurant and whatever else. So, and I think there's a gain to be made if you sequence your capital allocation or outlay appropriately, where if you build some housing first, right, it's included in your phasing, like that could be construction housing if you're in a remote location. So there's all sorts of, I think, unique things you can do and creative things you can do. And of course, economy of scale, same contractor for your housing and your tower or whatever you're building, right? You're going to have better bang for your buck than if you realize 3 years in that you're sunk, right? You can't keep the positions filled.
Right. And I think there's getting to be more and more case studies around this. If you look at, Turning Stone Casino up in New York, they just, I think, added 400 units just this year, right? So, there was a project in Cripple Creek, Colorado, where, they started out with 15 units, and I think now they're expanding, that facility. So, and, there's been a lot of supply side solutions in the hospitality space for a long time. So if this is a world that you're considering looking at, getting into, want to talk through some of these programs, or to some of the operators that have already deployed, like reach out to them or connect with us, and we can all jump on the phone together. We can connect you to the folks that have some really interesting case studies with employee assisted housing programs. So anyway, I think it's a relevant topic, and it's just when we see the effect of understaffed organizations on the people that remain.
Yeah.
It just create like the risk snowballs.
Yes.
And people get overworked, and then we start saying, well, how can I expect leaders to lead, and how can I expect producers to produce? And then our balance sheet starts to struggle, and we have service breakdowns, and we start modifying the value of programs. And before long, we look at this business and it doesn't look anything like what it looked like when it was high performing.
Yeah.
And so it's just kind of identifying this thing up front, saying, what do I need to know about that? And is there anything that I need to do? Is there anything I want to do? Is there anything I should do? And we're not, I'm not the one to say like it's a moral imperative. I'm just looking at the effect on the organization.
Yep.
And say, if something like this is required in order to sustain or to create a sustainable, vibrant organization for decades to come, like, we just have to make sure we emerge the conversations. And I thank you for kind of walking through this with me today. And as we kind of explore the idea in a different manner.
All right. So I really appreciate, Chris, you doing all of this work, and you've written and we're publishing a full article about this that has links to some of those case studies that you mentioned, has some of the metrics that we've talked about, nationwide trending. Tell people where they can find that. And I know the link's going to be in the show notes.
Yeah, this is going to release in the Indian Gaming October issue. So speaking, to our friends that are operating in the gaming hospitality space in native jurisdictions, pick up that copy. I'm sure you'll see it. It's probably right outside your office. So grab it, give it a read. We'll link to the online version of that article here in the show notes, and look forward to talking to you more about it.
Yeah. And the last thing I would say is I think this is a brand issue. What do we believe? What do we believe our value proposition is to our guests, is to our employees, is to our customers? And if I'm going to have leaders that encapsulate that brand and those values, what sort of teams do they need? What kinds of people do we need to be here? And what do I have to do? What can I do to help those folks be able to work here? Because the folks who are the right fit, they love it, right? I know the people who are the best fit love being here. So how do I make it as easy for them as possible, knowing that there is, like you said, the trends are all converging. So reach out, purposeandperformancegroup.com, or find us on LinkedIn, Facebook, wherever. And we would love to hear from you. Chris, thank you so much.
Thank you.
For everyone listening, let's go out and win the day.
Yeah, Hannah, we'll see you next time. Thanks, everyone.
Magic in the Room is hosted by Chris Province, Hannah Bratteroo, and Luke Freeman, and produced by Ben West. Theme music is by Evan Grimm. Title track Fake Love available on Apple Music. And this podcast was recorded at Storycatcher Studio with video and audio editing and production support by Brad O'Hara and Alicia Crum, with inspiration, strategy and technical support by yours truly, Neil Hughes. Magic in the Room is a production of Purpose and Performance Group. You can find us at purposeandperformancegroup.com, and remember, previous episodes are available at magicintheroom.com.